Despite overwhelming Allied air superiority, a lone Luftwaffe pilot, Erich Sommer, is on a high-altitude reconnaissance mission over the Normandy beachhead. Piloting the Arado Ar-234, the world's first operational jet-powered bomber and reconnaissance aircraft, Sommer remains untouchable, flying over 100 miles per hour faster than any contemporary Allied fighter. His 2-hour sortie returns more valuable photographic intelligence than the Luftwaffe had gathered in the previous 2 months. For Hitler, it's proof that his so-called wonder weapons may yet turn the tide of war. In late 1940, the German Air Ministry issued a requirement for a high-speed reconnaissance aircraft powered by the new turbojet engines then under development by Junkers and BMW. Arado was the only company to respond. The design team's main focus was speed. Flush riveting was used throughout to minimise drag, creating a smooth aerodynamic surface. A fully glazed rounded nose replaced the stepped cockpit common to many wartime aircraft, giving the jet a clean, uninterrupted profile and providing its sole pilot with excellent all-round visibility. Its cutting-edge turbojet engines were fitted in long nacelles beneath its high-mounted wings. Arado's new aircraft was designated the E-370. Engineers calculated a maximum speed of around 485 miles per hour, a figure that would later prove conservative. Its projected range was just about 2,000 kilometers, which actually fell just short of the Air Ministry's requirements. Aware that the Luftwaffe was dissatisfied with this, Arado sought to maximise the jet's internal fuel capacity by doing away with a conventional landing gear altogether. Instead, it would take off from a 3-wheeled trolley, which would be jettisoned once airborne. Landing would be accomplished by using retractable skids. The design was considered promising enough for the building of 2 prototypes to be authorised, the AR-234 V1 and V2. With surprisingly little outside interference from Air Ministry officials, the design process went remarkably smoothly. Unfortunately, the same could not be said for the Jumo 004 engines that would power Arado's new aircraft. Headed by Dr. Anselm Franz, the engine design team had been plagued with technical problems and material shortages since testing had begun in October 1940. Throughout development, the new engines were notoriously unreliable and temperamental. Early test engines suffered from excessive vibration. Only after a second redesign, with the compressor stators re-engineered and built from steel alloys instead of aluminium, was the vibration issue fixed. This and many other engineering challenges delayed the engine and in turn the 234, as well as Messerschmitt's new 262 jet fighter. Although the AR-234 V1 prototype was largely complete in late 1941, the Messerschmitt 262 project was given priority and claimed the slow trickle of engines that Junkers were managing to produce. Arado would have to wait until February 1943 before it finally received its first engines. And even then, they were only cleared for static ground and taxi tests, as Junkers still considered them too unreliable for flight. It wasn't until late spring that flight-ready engines were finally delivered to Arado. The flight test program began on the 30th of July 1943 when Flight Captain Zeller, Arado's chief test pilot, took AR-234 V1 for its first flight from the company test facility at Rheine Airfield in western Germany. Early test flights were promising, but unfortunately it wasn't long before disaster struck. On the 2nd of October, the V2 prototype was lost in a crash near Münster. A fire in the port wing, the failure of both engines and the loss of cockpit instruments sent the aircraft plummeting out of control and killing Flight Captain Zeller. Development, nevertheless, pressed on, and by September, Arado had 4 prototypes in the air. To address the shortcomings of the early Jumo 004 engines, which typically produced less thrust at lower speeds, the V3 and V4 prototypes onwards were fitted with racks beneath the outer wings to carry Walter HWK 109-500 rocket-assisted takeoff boosters. The extra thrust shortened takeoff runs while also conserving fuel that otherwise would have been consumed by the fuel-hungry jet engines. Once airborne, the boosters were jettisoned and parachuted back to the ground, allowing them to be recovered and reused. Throughout testing, the aircraft performed well in flight, but its unconventional takeoff and landing system was causing problems. In one incident, a pilot released the takeoff trolley at 200 feet, but its parachute failed to open and the trolley was smashed to pieces on impact. The landing skids were also proving unreliable, sometimes refusing to retract or extend correctly. This also meant the aircraft couldn't taxi after landing, coming to rest where it lay and requiring cranes to move it. During large operations, airfields would soon become cluttered with AR-234s, delaying other aircraft from landing and taking off. These concerns resulted in the cancellation of the planned A-series production variant. But Luftwaffe officials and Arado engineers had foreseen these problems before the first prototype had even been flown, so the Air Ministry had tasked Arado with adding a conventional landing gear as well as producing a new bomber variant. As development continued, the AR-234 undertook its first combat mission on the 2nd of August 1944, flown by Erich Sommer in the V5 prototype. Sommer's objective was to conduct photographic reconnaissance over the Allied beachhead in Normandy, a dangerous task given the near total Allied air superiority. But flying at 460 miles per hour in his state-of-the-art jet, he was able to outrun any Allied piston fighters. Equipped with two RB5030 cameras set to capture an image every 11 seconds, Sommer collected more valuable intelligence during this 2-hour sortie than the Luftwaffe had managed in the previous 2 months. The mission was a decisive success, marking the first operational reconnaissance flight by a jet-powered aircraft. Despite being overshadowed by the Me-262 during its development, it had now clearly demonstrated its strategic value to German High Command. Throughout August 1944, a number of AR-234 prototypes continued to conduct reconnaissance missions. V7 carried out the Luftwaffe's first jet-powered overflight of the United Kingdom. The objective of these missions was to monitor the threat of an Allied naval invasion along the Dutch coast. Flying at altitudes and speeds far beyond the reach of conventional piston engine fighters and ground fire, the jets were effectively untouchable. Following the Air Ministry's directive to develop a bomber variant with conventional landing gear, Arado produced a new series of prototypes, V9 through V11, which were to represent the AR-234B production model. The fuselage was slightly enlarged to accommodate a narrow tricycle undercarriage, but the aircraft's slender design left no space for an internal bomb bay, so bombs were to be carried on external racks. To allow the pilot to also serve as the bombardier, a Luftwaffe 7K bomb sight was mounted in the fuselage floor ahead of the control column, which the pilot would swing aside to operate. During bombing runs, a Patton PDS autopilot assisted in maintaining the flight path, while a periscope sight enabled the pilot to perform shallow-angle glide bombing. These modifications made the B model slightly heavier than the reconnaissance version, and the additional drag from external bombs further reduced its speed. Yet, even with a full bomb load, the jet could still reach 416 miles per hour, making it the fastest bomber in the Luftwaffe. The Air Ministry placed an order for 200 of the B series. The contract originally called for 2 variants, the B1 reconnaissance model and the B2 bomber, but Arado only ever produced the B2, choosing instead to create reconnaissance variants from B2 airframes rather than producing the B1 as a separate type. A small number of these B2s were converted into night fighter prototypes, designated B2N Nightingale. These were fitted with a Fugger 218 Neptune airborne radar and a pair of forward-firing 20mm MG-151 cannons. They also added what must have been a very cramped compartment for another crew member, a radar operator. The Nightingale conversions were assigned to an experimental Luftflotte Reich unit from around March 1945, conducting a handful of missions late in the war. However, the aircraft proved ill-suited for night interception, achieving no notable successes. The night fighter program remained limited and experimental in nature, with the concept abandoned before it could have any real operational impact. As the production of the AR-234B2 increased during the autumn of 1944, Kampfgeschwader 76, the only Luftwaffe unit to operate the aircraft in combat, received its first jets and began training. "I liked the Arado very much," said former Luftwaffe pilot Willy Kreismann. "It was a wonderful plane. I thought it was designed better than the Messerschmitt Me-262. It was a single-seater, so we didn't have time to practice much, so we had some dry classes. Landing and taking off was very different from a prop plane." Their first set of bombing missions targeted the docks at Antwerp and a railway station in Brussels. These were flown in small formations due to the limited number of jets available. Each aircraft typically carried a single 500-kilogram bomb, striking swiftly before withdrawing at speed, using the AR-234's performance to evade Allied fighters. During the Battle of the Bulge, AR-234s were again used for tactical reconnaissance and precision strikes. They carried out bombing attacks on artillery batteries, bridges and supply depots, as well as conducting high-speed reconnaissance missions over the Ardennes to track Allied troop movements and supply lines. In early spring 1945, KG-76 took part in desperate strikes against the Allied bridgehead over the Rhine at Remagen. On the 14th of March, 11 AR-234 bombers were dispatched to attack a newly constructed floating engineer bridge located just south of the Ludendorff Bridge, the last conventional bridge across the Rhine, which had been captured by the US 9th Armoured Division a week earlier on the 7th of March. Returning from a bomber escort, an American fighter pilot, Captain Bryan, spotted an AR-234 beginning a bombing run against the pontoon bridge. Bryan was one of the few Allied pilots who had previously encountered the jet, and he knew it was faster than his P-51 Mustang. Trying to evade a group of P-47s, the Arado broke away from the target and turned sharply, bleeding off speed and losing its greatest advantage. Bryan was able to position himself directly in the bomber's path. Diving down, he fired a burst of .50 caliber that destroyed the Arado's starboard engine. With the jet now slowed, he was able to remain on its tail and continue the attack. The pilot of the AR-234, Hauptmann Hans Hirschberger, waited too long before attempting to escape the stricken jet. It was his first and last combat sortie. "I don't know what he was thinking," Bryan later recalled, "but he should have bailed out while he still had height. I believe he feared I might fire at him in his parachute, something I would never have done." The German attacks failed to drop the Ludendorff railway bridge, and KG-76 had suffered a number of losses to anti-aircraft fire. On the 17th of March, the bridge eventually collapsed on its own, the result of cumulative damage, overuse and inherent structural weaknesses after years of neglect and wartime stress. But by then, the loss of the bridge had little effect. By late March of 1945, KG-76 was barely able to get off the ground. Critical shortages of fuel and spare parts limited the unit to just a few sorties. Its last operations of the war targeted Soviet forces that were closing in on Berlin. In early May, with defeat now inevitable, the few surviving AR-234s were either flown to airfields still under German control or deliberately destroyed to keep them from falling into enemy hands. Back in February of 1945, production had shifted to the C variant, which was to be the final production model. This variant was fitted with 4 BMW 003A1 turbojets, making it the world's first operational jet aircraft powered by 4 engines. 2 layouts were trialled, one with 4 separate nacelles and another pairing the engines in twin pods beneath the wings. While the lighter BMW engines offered a better thrust-to-weight ratio, the primary reason for the switch was to free up Jumo 004 engines for the Me-262. This was despite the engines proving to be much more reliable in AR-234 service. Its much less demanding flight profile placed far less strain on the engines than the high-G, high-thrust manoeuvres demanded by the 262 in fighter combat. 3 variants were planned: reconnaissance, bomber and ground attack, but the C series never entered operational service. Only 14 were completed at the Arado factory before Soviet forces captured the site, and by war's end, several airframes were discovered sitting outdoors, fully assembled but still awaiting engines. Today, only one AR-234 survives, serial number 140312. It was among 9 aircraft surrendered to British forces at Sola Airfield near Stavanger in Norway. Along with 3 other AR-234s, it was collected by a US technical intelligence team led by Colonel Harold Watson. Known as Watson's Wizards, the group was formed in the final days of the war to capture, evaluate and fly Germany's most advanced aircraft before they could be destroyed, concealed or fall into Soviet hands. On the 24th of June 1945, 4 AR-234s were flown from Sola to Cherbourg, joining a collection of 34 other captured German aircraft for shipment to the United States aboard the British carrier HMS Reaper. Once Reaper reached Newark, New Jersey, 2 of the Arados were flown to Freeman Field, Indiana for testing and evaluation. The fate of the second aircraft sent to Freeman remains unclear. A third AR-234 was removed from the carrier and reassembled by the US Navy, but it was deemed unflyable and was ultimately scrapped. After receiving new engines, radio and oxygen equipment, serial number 140312 was transferred to Wright Field, Ohio. Flight testing was completed on October 16, 1946, and after a period of time in storage during the early 1950s, the AR-234 was moved to the Smithsonian's Paul Garber Restoration Facility. The Smithsonian's restoration began in 1984, and it was complete in February 1989. Today, it sits on display at the museum's new Udvar Hazy Centre near Dulles, sporting a restored livery of a typical aircraft of KG-76. In many ways, the Arado AR-234 was the most advanced of the Third Reich's so-called wonder weapons. It never received the same attention or priority for the limited supply of jet engines as the Me-262, but the handful of 234s that did reach frontline units proved highly effective, especially in the reconnaissance role. Arriving too late and in too small a number to alter the course of the war, the AR-234 nevertheless stood out as a remarkable technical achievement. As the only jet-powered bomber to see service in World War II, it offered a glimpse into the future of aircraft technology. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like and perhaps subscribing, as it would really help me grow the channel. If you're interested in World War II aviation, perhaps check out these other videos.